There is security camera footage from Japan in 2025 that looks like a bad dream. A bear wandering the bright aisles of a supermarket, past the shelves and the chilled cabinets, as ordinary shoppers scatter. Bears at bus stops. A bear inside a hot spring resort, the kind of gentle countryside retreat people visit to relax. All year across northern Japan, the largest predator in the country kept turning up in the last places anyone expected it, in the middle of human life, and it kept hurting people. By the end of the year, the toll was the worst the country had ever recorded. 13 people killed, hundreds more injured, an entire region living on edge. The stories piled up all autumn, each one stranger than the one before. A bear strolling through a supermarket in the north, calm as a paying customer. A bear that got into a hot spring resort, one of those tranquil countryside inns people travel to precisely for peace and quiet. Attacks on farm roads, in orchards, at the edges of villages, in broad daylight. The northern prefecture of Akita became the epicenter, a rural region that found itself living under a kind of siege. Residents afraid to step outside, schools rethinking the walk home, whole communities on alert from dawn until dark. And then Japan did something that sounds like it belongs in a much older or much stranger country. It sent in the army. Soldiers from the self-defense forces were deployed to Akita, one of the hardest-hit areas in the north, to help deal with the bears. A modern, orderly, high-tech nation, mobilizing its military against wildlife. If you only read the headline, it lands as pure spectacle, a country so overrun by bears it had to call in the troops. But here is the part that reframes the whole thing, and it is the reason this is not just a wild news story, but a genuinely important one. Japan did not end up here because bears suddenly turned evil, or because some freak invasion came out of nowhere. Japan ended up here because of decisions Japan itself made, with good intentions, years and even decades ago. This deadliest ever bear year was not really an accident of nature. It was, to a large degree, the delayed bill for policies the country chose on purpose. And once you understand how a nation accidentally engineers its own predator crisis, the army in Akita stops looking like an overreaction and starts looking like the desperate final move it actually is. So let's get into it. Because the bear is the trigger here. The real story is the policy. Start with the sheer scale of what changed because the numbers are staggering. Japan is home to two kinds of bear. On the main islands, there is the Japanese black bear, and up on the northern island of Hokkaido, there is a large brown bear, a serious animal in the same family as the grizzly. These are not small or shy animals. A brown bear on Hokkaido can weigh several hundred kilograms and is every bit the apex predator its grizzly cousins are. Even the black bear of the main islands, smaller and usually far more retiring, is powerful enough to kill a person without much effort when it is frightened or starving. For most of modern Japanese history, though, ordinary people in the town simply did not have to think about them because the bears kept to the deep forest and the forest kept its distance. That quiet, unspoken arrangement is exactly what broke. And the population of these animals has not crept up. It has exploded. By some estimates, the number of bears in Japan grew from somewhere around 15,000 a little over a decade ago to more than 50,000 by 2025. That is not a gentle uptick. That is a predator population more than tripling in a single generation in one of the most densely populated developed countries on Earth. 50,000 large bears spreading out, looking for food, in a country the size of California with a population pushing 120 million people. And in 2025, those swelling bear numbers collided with a bad piece of luck. The bears of Japan fatten themselves in autumn largely on nuts, on acorns and beech nuts, the mast crop of the forests, packing on the fat they need to survive hibernation. And in 2025, that crop largely failed. So you had a record number of hungry bears facing a forest that suddenly could not feed them right as winter loomed. It is worth understanding how tightly a bear's whole year runs on that autumn feast. The nuts are not a snack. They are the difference between surviving hibernation and not. And a bear that cannot fatten up in the fall is a bear driven by real, gnawing desperation to find calories anywhere it possibly can. Multiply that desperation across a record population in a single failed crop autumn, and you get tens of thousands of large animals all pushed toward the same decision at the same moment, which is to stop avoiding people and start following the food. Starving animals do not respect boundaries. They followed their noses down out of the hills toward the orchards, the farms, the garbage, the towns, toward the supermarkets and the hot springs and the bus stops. The failed nut crop was the spark. But the reason there was so much dry tinder lying around, the reason there were 50,000 bears in the first place, and almost nothing standing between them and the towns, that goes back to a decision Japan made when it decided to be kind. Because Japan did not always love its bears. For a long time, it treated them roughly the way most countries have treated large predators, as pests and threats to be killed. Bears were hunted hard, including a traditional practice of taking them in spring straight out of their dens. And it worked, in the grim way these things work. On the southern island of Kyushu, the local population of black bears was pushed all the way to extinction, gone, wiped off an entire major island. That extinction was a wake-up call. It made Japan realize that its bears were not an infinite nuisance, but a vanishing native species that could actually be lost. And so, in the closing decades of the 20th century, the country changed course. It reined in the hunting. It restricted the spring hunts. It moved bears into the category of wildlife to be protected and preserved rather than simply culled. It was, by every reasonable standard of the time, the right and responsible thing to do. And it succeeded. You have to sit with how genuinely good that decision was, because it matters for everything that follows. A country looked at a native animal it had spent centuries persecuting, watched an entire island population blink out, felt something close to guilt, and chose restraint. It is exactly the kind of course correction that conservationists everywhere spend their lives arguing for. Japan did it, and the bears responded precisely the way a protected species is supposed to. They bred, they spread, they reclaimed old ground. On its own terms, the policy was a textbook conservation win. That success is the founding incident of this entire crisis, and the reasons it curdled into 13 deaths come in 3 parts, and each one is more uncomfortable than the last. The first reason is the one no government can dodge. When bears are killing people, 13 in a single year, dragging victims off farm tracks and appearing inside shops, the state has to be seen to act, forcefully and fast. Rural residents were genuinely terrified, afraid to walk to their fields or send their kids to school. In that situation, a government cannot give a lecture about long-term ecology. It has to do something visible and immediate, and deploying the self-defense forces to the worst-hit prefecture is about as visible as it gets. So the first pillar is straightforward crisis response. Bodies are piling up, a scared population wants protection, and the army is the biggest, most reassuring tool in the box. And the fear it was answering was not abstract. In the worst-hit areas, people had genuinely stopped doing ordinary things, harvesting their crops, visiting elderly relatives, letting their children walk anywhere alone. A bear inside a shop or a spa has broken the one rule everyone quietly depended on, that the wild stays in the wild. Restoring even the appearance of control is something a government simply has to attempt when that rule collapses, whatever the deeper cause later turns out to be. That part is real, and it is only the surface, because the moment you look at what those soldiers were actually allowed to do, the whole thing tips into the surreal. If you are enjoying watching a terrifying news story quietly turn into a story about demographics and paperwork, you should subscribe, because that is the exact machinery this channel loves to take apart. The stories where the headline is an animal and the answer underneath is a census and a committee. And you will want to be here for the second reason, because it is the one that flips the blame entirely. Because here is the second reason, and it is the twist. The bear crisis was not caused by a failure of Japanese policy. It was caused in large part by a success. The conservation worked. Japan set out to stop its bears from disappearing, and its bears very much stopped disappearing. But that recovery landed on a countryside that was doing the opposite of thriving. At the very same time the bears were multiplying under protection, rural Japan was emptying out. This is a country with one of the oldest populations in the world and a decades-long drift of young people from the villages to the cities. Farmland was abandoned. Whole hamlets aged and shrank, and in some cases simply ceased to function. That inhabited, farmed, worked-over land used to be a buffer, a zone of human activity between the deep forest and the town that bears instinctively avoided. As the people left, the buffer went feral. The forest crept back in, the abandoned fields grew over, and the bears simply followed the returning wilderness right up to the edge of, and then into, the towns that were left. Conservation filled the hills with bears exactly as the human world retreated and opened the door. Sit with that, because it is the cruel heart of the whole thing. Nobody did anything wrong, and that is precisely the problem. A good policy and a sad demographic trend, each reasonable on its own, combined into a body count. There is even a word in Japanese for the kind of landscape that used to hold the line. The Satoyama, the managed border country of rice paddies, coppiced woods, and small farms that sat between the mountains and the towns. For centuries that lived-in zone worked as a kind of soft fence, too busy with people and dogs and daily activity for a bear to risk crossing. As the villages aged and emptied, the Satayama fell quiet, the underbrush closed back in, and the fence quietly rotted away. The bears did not break through anything. They simply walked into a gap that human beings had left wide open by leaving, and that same emptying out crippled the obvious defense. Japan's traditional check on bears was its hunters, and the hunters are vanishing too. The country's licensed hunters have collapsed in number over the past few decades, from over 500,000 in the 1970s to well under half that today, and a huge share of the ones who remain are elderly, many of them past 60. So the country arrived at its worst bear year with record bears, a failed food crop, an overgrown countryside, and a thin graying line of aging hunters expected to deal with all of it. That is why the army had to come. And yet, because of Japan's very strict gun laws, those soldiers largely could not shoot the bears at all. Their job was to help build and haul the heavy steel box traps to transport the aging civilian hunters who were legally allowed to pull the trigger and to help deal with the carcasses. Japan deployed its military against an enemy its military was not permitted to fire on. It is almost the perfect image of the whole predicament. The country had the force, but the actual power to act was tangled up in decades of its own careful, well-meaning rules. Which brings us to the third reason, and the hardest one, which is what Japan has decided to do about it. The country is now, formally and deliberately, reversing itself. The government has moved to unwind the very protection that defined the last generation of bear policy. In 2025, it changed the law to allow emergency shooting of bears inside residential areas, handing local officials the power to authorize a kill in town, something that had been tangled in red tape before. And the national guidance has now flipped its entire philosophy from protecting and maintaining bear numbers to managing them down. There are plans to sharply expand the ranks of government hunters, roughly tripling a specialized workforce whose job is to kill problem bears, and to set formal targets to remove a serious fraction of the bear population every year. The new national guidance even redraws the map, carving out enhanced management zones around towns where trapping, brush clearing, and electric fencing are meant to hold the bears back. And it sets removal targets in the hardest-hit regions at roughly a fifth of the estimated population a year. After decades spent bringing the bear back, Japan is now organizing, in careful, bureaucratic language, to push it firmly back down. And you can understand every step of that, and still see the trap inside it, because the rifle only reaches the bears. It does not reach the actual cause. You can triple the hunters and legalize shooting on Main Street and set a harvest target for every region. And the deepest driver of this whole crisis will still be sitting there untouched, because you cannot cull an empty village back to life. The bears came down because the people went up to the cities and never came back, and no amount of bear control repopulates the countryside or reverses the age of a nation. Japan can absolutely shoot its way to fewer bears. It cannot shoot its way to more people in the hills. So the culling, however necessary it feels right now, is treatment for a symptom of something much larger and much harder. A country quietly hollowing out from the inside, with the forest and its hungry tenants moving in to fill the space that people used to hold. So it stands, at the close of the worst bear year in the country's history. The traps are set in the hills above the towns. The aging hunters go out with the soldiers who cannot fire, and the new rules that let officials order a kill in a residential street are on the books. The bears keep coming down out of a forest that grew back over the fields nobody farms anymore, drawn by hunger toward the shrinking, graying towns at the bottom of the valleys. And a nation that once felt guilty enough about killing its bears to spend a generation saving them is now writing the paperwork to start again. The 13 people who died in 2025 died in a genuine tragedy, and the fear in those northern towns is completely real, and the bears themselves were doing nothing more sinister than looking for food. In a year, the forest failed them. There is no villain in this story, which is exactly what makes it so hard. Just a kind decision, and a demographic tide, and a failed crop, all arriving in the same terrible autumn in a country that saved its bears a little too well and looked up one day to find them standing in the supermarket.